As a community, we build empathy, curiosity, joy, and connection when we share stories with you. Welcome to Storytellers Project, part of the USA Today network.
Yesterday, as the worst of the pandemic raged, childhood hunger skyrocketed. Even now, 1 in 6 kids may be living with hunger. Today, we start rebuilding, and tomorrow, we'll give them everything they need to grow up happy and strong. For their tomorrow, we're reimagining a world where every kid has the food they need to thrive. Visit nokidhungry.org/rebuild to find out what you can do for kids in your community.
Hi, I'm Brett McGinnis. I'm with the Reno Gazette-Journal here in Reno, Nevada, where I work as the engagement editor. And I just want to say how much we appreciate you sharing your evening with us for the Storytellers Project. Tonight, we're joining Humana, No Kid Hungry, and 5 Americans from throughout the West Coast to create community. Since 2016, the Storytellers Project has brought more than 100 shows each year to communities across the country. But we've canceled our in-person season as part of USA Today Network's response to the ongoing pandemic. So we've handpicked incredible storytellers and inspiring people to bring you a story about the meaning of home and all the rebuilding and reimagining that requires. It will be charming, funny, relatable, and touching. Let's say hi to our storytellers tonight. Sharee Hertz of Phoenix, Arizona.
Hi, Brett. How are you this evening?
How are you doing?
Doing well.
And Carol Lopez-Lee of Ventura, California.
Hey there, good to see you.
Bob GERSZTYN of Salem, Oregon.
Hi, Brett.
Hey, Bob. Jim Fleming of Reno, Nevada.
Hey there, Brett McGinnis.
Jim, how you doing? And Sally Jo Bano of Phoenix, Arizona.
Hi, everyone.
We'll also have a Q&A with Pamela Taylor, Chief Communications and Marketing Officer for No Kid Hungry, so we can learn a little bit more about how all of us can help. Tonight's show does benefit No Kid Hungry. You can donate right now by going to nokidhungry.org/USA Today. Here's why. 1 of 6 kids in America today could face hunger because of the coronavirus. In the wake of the pandemic, millions of children are still living with hunger. Rebuilding starts with feeding every child in every community. With generous support from Humana, No Kid Hungry is helping schools and communities get the food, support, and equipment they need to feed children. Humana is proud to support No Kid Hungry in helping to connect kids to healthy meals, and they're making your donation go even further by matching all donations through this page up to $25,000. Again, that's nokidhungry.org/USA Today. Child hunger is a very real problem in America, but unlike a lot of things, there are real workable solutions, and No Kid Hungry and their partners are experts at making them work. This crisis has shown that unemployment and hunger can touch any family, anywhere, anytime. And it's on all of us to ensure kids get the food they need regardless of circumstance. No Kid Hungry is singularly focused on not just fighting childhood hunger, but ending it for good. Through emergency grants, hands-on guidance, and rallying the right people, they're helping put meals on the table for hungry children. Again, you can be part of the solution right now at nokidhungry.org/USA Today. Now, tonight is not a TED Talk. It's not Toastmasters. It's not a how-to talk, an inspirational speech, educational lecture, or a slideshow. We're not going to sell you anything except maybe a subscription. And of course, we are asking for donations to No Kid Hungry. What this is tonight, this is storytelling. And storytelling is based on visiting. You open your heart and your mind and you pay attention to a person you care about and want to feel closer to. So we invite you to do that tonight. Before we get started, I want to note that one of our stories tonight deals with sexual assault. If you or someone you know has been the victim of sexual assault, help is available. The National Sexual Assault Hotline provides confidential 24/7 support. Find help and resources at rainn.org/resources or by calling 800-656-4673. Tonight, some of these storytellers are going to be polished and professional. Some will be casual and conversational. We ask you to receive all of them because that's how community change happens. We believe creating empathy and understanding is vital, and especially in times of uncertainty. And I am so excited to welcome up our first teller tonight. It's Sharee Hertz. She has a story about how her childhood home became a Polaroid shrine. Sharee?
Thank you so much, Brett. So, growing up, I learned two things about my Nana. One was that she wasn't like most grandmothers. My father's mother, Grandma, she was warm, and there was always a bunch of us kids running around her house. She sewed, she baked, and her kitchen always smelled like coffee and lemon cookies. My mom's mom, not so much. Her house was always quiet. There were no children running afoot. It was filled with knickknacks that children were not allowed to touch. She didn't bake, she didn't sew, and she admittedly wasn't the best cook. Second thing I noticed about my Nana was although I wasn't her oldest grandchild or even her youngest grandchild, I was her favorite. She had this little family tree photo frame, and from each branch of the tree dangled a little picture of all four of her children, my mom included. At the top of that little tree dangled a picture of me. Growing up, I spent a lot of time in my nana's house. And I thought it was an interesting place to be because there was always pictures up all over the walls of different family members from multiple parts of the country and pictures of her and her travels all over the world. I would sit there and look at the picture of her getting on a cruise ship. I would look at the picture of her standing with the soldiers in front of Buckingham Palace at the Eiffel Tower in Paris. But my favorite was the photo of her in St. Thomas on a white sandy beach with a big smile and a tiny bikini. My nana was also very particular. In her house, there was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. She called a thing by its name. She did not like slang, and she did not like me to use slang either. So 5, 6 years old, she would say something to me like, "Can you go and put my hairbrush back into the Chester drawer next to my handkerchief?" Or, "Can you go and collect my Bible and pull it off of the secretary and bring it to me?" I didn't know what these things meant, but I learned. She taught me. I always liked being in her house because it was constant. Things didn't really change, and it gave me a sense of comfort. Probably because my mother and I, we never lived in a house. We always lived in apartments. And so we would go from apartment to apartment. I would go from school to school, moving around. Well, one year we were living in this okay part of East Oakland, California. And I was just a few years out from going to junior high school. And the junior high in my area was really rough. It wasn't known necessarily for academic success and excellence. My grandmother thought for me they could do better. And she did. Her and my mother went looking for a house, and they found one that they liked in a safer neighborhood with better schools. And my nana bought it. My mother and I moved into it. And for me, this house was like something I had only seen on TV. I had never lived in anything like it. It was a corner house with this big, huge front yard. It had a garage, it had a backyard. I had never lived in a place with a backyard before. But my favorite thing about that house was down at the end of the hall was a bedroom, and that was mine, all mine. So we move into this house, and from the 5th grade all the way through high school, I get a chance to put down some roots, and I get a chance to establish some lifelong relationships and friendships, which was really great. My senior year of high school, my grandmother retires from working in a glass bottling factory in Oakland, and she decides she's going to move into the house that she bought for me. Well, my mom decides living with her mother at that stage of life was not something she was going to do, and she moves out. So I tried to stick it out with my grandmother, but she was so out of touch. And living with the teenager was just something that was, she was really out of her depth. And she once came across some good and fruity candies that I must have dropped out of my pocket running out of the house one day. And she gave them to my mom to show her evidence of possibly some drugs that I might be taking to explain my strange behavior. My mother just informed her that it was candy. So eventually I moved out too. But I would always go back, and I went back and forth on a regular basis. And I was always visiting with my grandmother and spending time with her in the house that my nana had bought for me. And I noticed Nana started to, of course, go into the house and put her things in different rooms and fill up the closets. But she didn't touch my room. And down at the end of the hall, my room stayed exactly as it was in high school. I mean, I'm talking my Bobby Brown poster on one wall, my Michael Jordan poster on the other wall, and dead center right in front, Michael Jackson. So I could always go and visit her and ground myself in that room in my childhood around all my things and my photos. She also started to put up pictures of me in her living room. She stopped traveling, was enjoying her retirement, was just relaxing. And she put up a picture of me at 5 years old. She put a picture up of me in a school play. She put a picture of me in cheerleading. She put a picture of me in high school, graduating from high school. And with her beautiful and beloved Polaroid camera, which was an Instagram back in the day, that was the only way you can get a picture right then and there in the moment. She would document my arrival with her Polaroid camera, taking a picture of me as soon as I walked through the door. So literally, I was sitting in her living room one day and noticed there's a picture of me as of 5 years old and me as of 5 minutes ago. And I said, Nana, it's like the shrine of Sharee in here. Anytime friends would come over, I would just tell them, don't even ask about the pictures. Don't even ask. And we continued this ritual. Even after I moved out of state, moved to Arizona to go to college, I would go back and visit her, and we would do this again. I would get there, she would document my arrival with the picture. I would walk down to the end of the hallway to my bedroom, and I would ground myself in the bedroom of my childhood that I grew up in. And I knew that we wouldn't have forever and that I wouldn't always have her with me, but I did think that we had a lot more time. Something must have told me that I didn't, because one weekend while I was away at college, I just had this inkling that I needed to see her. So I scraped together my pennies and I got a plane ticket and I flew home to spend the weekend with her. And we visited, and I'm sitting in the living room and I get there and she takes my picture, and I go down to the end of the hall and I look at my bedroom and take a look at all my photos and my things, and we're visiting, and I say, Nana, how are you doing? How are things going? And she would say, I'm doing all right. I'm just praying that God lets me be here long enough to see you graduate from college. Now, I just dismiss this as silly talk. My grandmother was very healthy, feisty, and had a lot more energy than most people that I knew. So I would just dismiss it. A few months later, that call came, and I wasn't ready. She had apparently had a heart attack, but she still managed to drive herself to the hospital. And I flew back home to help my mother pack up some of Nana's things, packing up into the house that she had bought for me. And I slept in my bed that one last time, all the way down at the end of the hall. But there was something different about the house without her there to take that photo of me. Back at home, we learned that my grandmother had been a very savvy businesswoman, and Nana had acquired several properties and even managed to leave me a little bit of an inheritance. But I was still so heartbroken that when the check came, I just put it into my bank account and I tried not to think about it. I would rather have that time back with her. One Saturday morning, I was driving down the street and I see this sign for open house. Now, I am a sucker for open house. I love going into the houses, see how it's decorated. I like to see the architecture of the house. And inside of this house was this adorable woman and her child, just so lovely. They welcomed me in, they let me look around. And after a few minutes in the house, I started to feel very familiar, like I had been there before. And I said, there wouldn't happen to be down at the end of that hall a bedroom, would there? Sure enough, I go down to the end of the hall and there's a bedroom just like the house my nana bought for me. I finish up my visit and I thank the lady for inviting me in and for her hospitality. And when I'm leaving, she says, I have a good feeling about you. I hope you'll put in an offer. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I was just curious about the open house, but I'm not in the market for a house. And she says, but still, just Just think about it. So I did. And I reached out to a friend of mine who was a realtor and I asked, what he thought. And he said, well, I'm going to tell you this. It's a really good house. It's a really good deal. And so I did have that money that was sitting in my bank account. So I bought the house. And now that house is filled with pictures of her. I'm actually sitting right now in that bedroom down at the end of the hall. Sometimes when I'm coming home and I pull into the driveway and I just pause for a moment and I look up and I think, Nana would have really liked this house. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharee. Thank you for introducing us to Nana. I feel like we really know her, but we don't know her name. Can you share her name with us?
Yes, my Nana's name was Shirley Mae Thomas.
Shirley Mae Thomas was absolutely right. Good and plenties are weird. So thank you so much for sharing that.
My pleasure.
I want to thank our sponsor of tonight's show. Humana is sponsoring Storytellers Project not just tonight, but all shows nationally and now virtually, because they believe that sharing stories makes for healthier people and healthier communities. And we need these connections to each other and to health now more than ever. With the COVID-19 vaccines available where you live, consider talking to your healthcare professional about what's right for you. Visit Humana.com for more about what they're doing each and every day to connect you to better health in your community. And again, Humana is proud to support No Kid Hungry in helping to connect kids to healthy meals, and they're making your donation go even further tonight by matching all donations through our page up to $25,000. Again, that page, nokidhungry.org/USA Today. Our next teller is Kara Lopez Lee of Ventura, California, with a story about how she traveled halfway across the world to heal a family divide that echoed through generations.
Thank you, Brett. So usually I love to frame and display old family photos where I can see them every day. It feels like the expression of a deep urge for connection and belonging. But my grandma gave me this one family photo I keep hidden in my file cabinet. It's an old black and white of this Chinese man who looks kind of grim, and he's wearing this little bow tie and he has a big blocky head, much like grandma's and mine. It's her father, Ma Bing Sum, a long ago Chinese restaurant owner from El Paso, Texas. And Grandma was a child of both Chinese and Mexican immigrants, and I was always begging her for family stories. So I'm pretty sure she gave me the photo of my great grandpa, so I would always remember who to blame. You see, back in the early 1900s, Ma Bing Sum took a Mexican bride less than half his age. And then he had sex with his wife's younger sister when that girl was 14 and he was 36. And his wife's sister was Grace Lopez, the girl who gave birth to the family secret, my grandma. So Ma Bing Sum convinced his in-laws not to tell anyone he was the father, because look, if his reputation were ruined, who would support the family? To this day, one of his other daughters still refuses to speak to me because I dared to call what her father did rape. And look, I get it. I mean, to her, he was a sweet old guy who protected her and taught her how to cook. And he was also a pillar of El Paso's old Chinatown, who helped his fellow immigrants with immigration papers, getting jobs, even helped pay their doctor bills. But to the Lopez side of the family, well, he was just the man who ruined my great-grandma. They said that Grace was a sweet, chirpy, happy young thing until he got hold of her, and then she became a silent, withdrawn shell of a girl until she died of tuberculosis at 17. I only have one photo of her, and I keep that one out in the open, sitting up on a shelf where I can see it, and she's wearing this little 1920s bell-shaped cloche hat full of little flowers. But her eyes look really haunted to me, and I look into those sad eyes and I often wonder if Grace really just died of a broken heart. And I've long wrestled with the idea that I contain within me the genetic history of both my great-grandma and my great-grandpa, of both the victim and the perpetrator. Here's how a single act of abuse can reverberate through generations. So first of all, my grandma, Grace's daughter, was raised as an orphan among her mother's sisters. And the Lopez aunts made her cook and clean and take care of their kids like Cinderella until Grandma gave birth out of wedlock to my dad. And one of her aunts suggested she should ask her father for help. My father? My grandma was stunned. She had always been told that her father was dead. So she wrote him an angry letter. And he responded by giving her a job waiting tables in his Chinese restaurant. My dad describes these large family gatherings with many of his cousins receiving tons of gifts from all the aunts and uncles, while my father opened a single present from his mother. So Grandma grew into this bitter woman who never really learned how to show affection to her son, who became my emotionally distant dad. Now, my mother, who happens to be white, left the family picture when I was 2. And that's how I also ended up being raised by Grandma, my dad's mother. So it was one of the few things, by the way, that she commiserated with me about. She said, "Carol, when you lose your mother, you lose everything." It sure felt that way. I mean, whenever I hugged Grandma, her arms never seemed to rest comfortably anywhere, as if even her arms never knew where they belonged. Once when I was 4 years old, I ran home crying because a bully beat me up, and my grandma said, "I'm not always going to be here to help you. You're going to have to learn to work some things out yourself." I felt like I was always running home and never quite getting there. So, when I'm 45, in 2008, I decided to start writing a historical novel to answer my burning question. How do you find home when you feel like you don't belong? And I go in search of my great-grandfather's past. And one of my most exciting clues comes from one of his sons, my favorite uncle, who tells me his father was born in the village of Gonghao, China. So off I travel to Gonghao, only to discover it's not a single village, but a district of 11 villages. No idea which one was his. But the locals take me to a 99-year-old man from one of several Ma family villages, hoping he might be able to tell me something. So quick sketch of Gyeon village. Rice paddy, rice paddy, rice paddy, a couple of dozen gray brick cottages, and several ruins of these old Western-style mansions that were built decades ago by overseas Chinese to show off their American-made wealth. So my translator and I get whisked into one of the small cottages and then out into a courtyard filled with chattering women and the village patriarch, old Mr. Ma, who rises from his wheelchair to greet us, even though this clearly costs him great effort. He is so slight that I can make out the contours of his skull, but he has bird-bright eyes and intense energy for a man of 99. So the women hustle me into this chair and thrust tea and dumplings at me in an act of hospitality that's so aggressive. It's like, make yourself at home or else. Mr. Ma is really excited to meet an American with ties to the Ma people, but communication is tough. He speaks a local dialect. So I ask questions in English. My translator asks his granddaughter in Cantonese, she asks her grandpa in Toisanese, and then everything comes back the other way. It takes 10 minutes just to explain, my great-grandpa was Ma Bing Sum. He was born in 1887, but he left Gonghao before you were born, so I don't expect you to know much. I'm just hoping for a little local history. But Mr. Ma refuses to give up until he's found a connection between us. And so I decide to show him the photo of my great-grandpa and an old letter written in Chinese to him from his son, my favorite uncle. And Mr. Ma looks at these and his face lights up. Ho, 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 Ma Bing Sum! And a flurry of Chinese flies overhead. My translator says, your great-grandpa is from this village. Mr. Ma pulls out a red book filled with the names of Gitlan's male lineage going back centuries, and he turns to a page that features the names of Ma Bing Sum and his eldest 3 sons. What's more, Mr. Ma did meet my great-grandpa back in the 1930s when he came back for a visit. One of those Western-style mansions was built by my family. The clincher comes when Mr. Ma says, Ma Bing Sum had a Mexican wife from Paso? My eyes fill with tears. But why? For this stranger I never knew, who my grandma always hated. I can only tell you, something tugs at my belly button. The past. Mr. Ma invites me to sign the red book. I say, but I'm a woman. He says, it would be our honor. You are family. And you know, it's true. This sweet old man and these women stuffing me with dumplings are my distant cousins. I feel Ma Bing Sum there with us, finally claiming my family as his, never again to be dismissed as, the bastard branch of the family tree. And with my signature in that book, I accept him too, declaring in writing, I belong. And that's how I become the only woman in Gitlan's book of male ancestors. When back in America, I share this story with my grandma, and she responds by giving me a rare gift. She smiles. In that moment, I come home. My grandma has since passed away, but if you came over to my house, her portrait is one of the first things you would see. Carolina, in the 1940s, this glamorous 20-something knockout with this long rolled back and pinned hair and these beautiful but piercing eyes and this reluctant smile that she'll now be wearing for the rest of my life. And in gratitude to this woman, my surrogate mom, who showed love by trusting me with her secrets, in honor of that gift, I still keep her father's picture hidden in a drawer.
Kara, thank you so much for sharing that. I know it took a lot of heart to share that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We'll be right back.
During this crisis, millions of Americans are struggling to afford food for their children. No Kid Hungry is here to help. We're working with organizations nationwide to feed children during and beyond this crisis. If you need help, simply visit nokidhungry.org/help to find free meals for your kids. No questions asked, no registration needed. It's just healthy food for kids who need it. Go to nokidhungry.org/help today.
Again, this show is benefiting No Kid Hungry, a national nonprofit dedicated to connecting children with food. We have plenty of food in the U.S. and nutrition programs that work. The problem is not enough children have access to them. So No Kid Hungry gives schools and community groups the funds and guidance needed to launch and grow programs that feed more kids. That includes school breakfasts, summer meals served at schools and community centers, after-school meals, and emergency feeding programs during times of crisis. They do research and they advocate for solutions that work. When you donate to No Kid Hungry, you help break down whatever barriers stand between a hungry child and a healthy meal. Consider donating now at nokidhungry.org/USA Today. Our third storyteller tonight is Bob GERSZTYN, who took a disastrous journey moving from one home to another. Bob?
Well, it was Labor Day in 1984, and my pregnant wife, Kathy, and I had just finished eating dinner with our 5 children who were aged 2 through 10 at the Wendy's in Barstow, California. We got in our Dodge Diplomat station wagon that was pulling a overloaded trailer that I later found out was overloaded to 7,000 pounds, 5,000 pounds over the limit. And we were heading back to our home in Michigan from Bakersfield, California. As we were traveling in our car, I realized that the entrance to the freeway was at the top of the steepest hill in town. So I started to get a running start because there was a traffic light at the base of the hill. And as soon as I started to accelerate, a police car appeared behind me. So the light turned yellow and I had to slam on the brakes. When the light turned green, I began to accelerate and I made it up to 20 miles an hour before the car started losing speed and finally came to a dead stop about 20 feet short of the freeway entrance. The police car behind me turned on its flashers and the officer came up to my open window and asked if he could call me a tow truck. Well, we were almost broke at this time, and I told him that it would be better if he could just give me a push with his reinforced wooden bumper, and we'd be able to make it to the entrance. He did, and we did. We were traveling back to California, or to Michigan, after we had been in California and on the West Coast for 13 years. In 1971, I transferred my job with the post office to Los Angeles, California, and my girlfriend and I moved there. A few weeks later, we got married. Then we had kids. I graduated from Bible college, and I was ordained a minister. I resigned from the post office, and I got a job at inner city church in Los Angeles, where I was the assistant pastor for 4 years until 1980. In 1980, we felt that God was calling us to Oregon. So we moved to Oregon. When we got to Oregon, everything went wrong, and we decided to split and just go somewhere else. And I call this my Jonah period because I was running away from what God wanted me to do. Well, after we traveled to Texas, back to California, back to Oregon, and then finally to Bakersfield, California, where I had a job that I hated, and the doors seemed to be closed on going back into the ministry. With frustration, we decided that we were going to move back to Michigan. So because we had moved around so much, we were pretty well broke now, and I had enough money to rent a trailer instead of a truck. I crammed almost everything we owned into that trailer, and now we were heading on our way back to Michigan, where my mother was expecting us. And as we crossed the border into Arizona, it was after midnight, and I found the first rest stop that I could to go to sleep for the night because I didn't want to get a motel, just wanted to get going. The next day I got up and we were heading to Flagstaff as our destination for the day. Now, Flagstaff has an elevation of 7,000 feet, and we were coming from one of the lowest points in the U.S., so it was uphill all the way. I'd already burned out one transmission before I got 40 miles outside of Bakersfield, and we had to turn around and I had to put a rebuilt in it. So I didn't want to burn out this transmission, and as we're going up some of the steep upgrades, we slowed down to probably 10 or 15 miles an hour. And I knew that if we came to a dead stop, that we wouldn't get going again. So it was a white knuckle trip all the way. We made it to Flagstaff and we got a motel, got something to eat. Next day, we head to Albuquerque. Now it was downhill the rest of the way. And when we got to Albuquerque, we got a motel for the night and we felt confident we were going to be able to make it back. No problem now. The next day, we were going to go down into the Texas-Oklahoma panhandle, and the descent was 3,000 feet all at one time. And I decided to make up for extra time, for lost time from when we were traveling up. So I got up to 80 miles an hour, pulling my 7,000-pound trailer when it jackknifed. It jackknifed not once, but twice. And both times, somehow, I got it under control. As my wife was telling me, you need to slow down before you kill us. Well, I slowed down to 50 miles an hour. We made it over the Texas-Oklahoma border, and we got something to eat at a hamburger stand. And an hour later, 3 of my kids ended up getting food poisoning, throwing up, and getting sick. So we got a motel for the night early that night. Next day, we headed through the rest of Oklahoma, made it into Missouri. And as we made it into Missouri, we got a motel. And then the next day, we headed through St. Louis. And as we were crossing the Mississippi River into Illinois, I noticed that the car was losing power. So I pulled over on the side and I popped the hood. And I saw that the metal fuel line was cracked. And I got some electrical tape I had in the glove compartment and wrapped it around it for a temporary fix, got off at the next exit, found an auto parts store, bought a length of rubber tubing, replaced the metal tubing, and we were on our way again. So we made it all the way to the end of Illinois, and we just pulled into a rest stop because we wanted to get to Michigan the next day. It was only 600 more miles from here. So we slept in that rest stop until the early light woke us up. And then we're heading to Michigan. And when we got to Anderson, Indiana, which was about 300 miles away from Michigan, my oldest son pointed to the car next to us that was pointing to our trailer. And I looked in the extended side view mirror and I noticed that flames were coming out of the wheel well on the passenger side. So I grabbed a gallon of water and I got out of the car and I doused the fire. And after the fire was out, I noticed that the wheel was cockeyed and I said, well, we're not going to be able to get to Michigan with that. So I got back in the car and I was going to pull off the freeway to a telephone and call the GERSZTYN office. But as soon as I tried to move the car, the wheel fell totally off. The car hit the ground with a thud and a scraping sound. So I stopped and I noticed that there was a 5-foot high cyclone fence separating the freeway from a residential area. So I jumped the fence and I knocked on the door of the closest house, and a lady came to the door, and when I told her our situation, she said I could use the telephone. I called the GERSZTYN office and they sent out a tow truck with a chain and winch and pulled my trailer onto it. We followed the GERSZTYN driver to the yard and they offered us a truck to replace our trailer and to reload everything. Well, we've been on the road for a week now and we are exhausted. And my widowed mother was expecting us, and I thought we could get there tonight, no problem. So I told them that we would come back the next day or the day after we were rested up and move everything. The problem with that is, well, that comes later. I should have gotten that truck. So we get back to Michigan, and when we tell my mother what happened, she goes, it wasn't God's will for you to move here, obviously. And I was shocked when she said that. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm 37 years old. It's like I got a pregnant wife. I got 5 kids. I'm homeless. I don't have a job. I'm just about broke. And everything I own is 300 miles away. So I move in with my mother temporarily and call the GERSZTYN office the next day. And they tell me that I can't get my possessions until I pay them $800 because the trailer was overloaded and it's my fault that the axle broke. So now I try to get out of paying it because I'm broke, but it's useless. And finally, after 6 weeks, I borrow the money from my mother, and a friend of mine goes down with me to Indiana and we load it all into a truck and we bring it back. In the meantime, though, my best friend from high school's mother had a house that she wanted to rent, and she offered it to me at a really reasonable price, and then even said that she'd give me the first month's rent free if I painted the garage, which I did. And after that, I decided to go back to the post office that I had transferred from 13 years earlier and apply for reinstatement. So I applied for reinstatement, and by Thanksgiving, I was back at work at the post office, had a full-time job with benefits, and was living in a comfortable house. And I knew that God was going to work everything out because I was a minister and I did have faith in him. So now we decided that it was a mistake moving back to Michigan. So in July of 1986, we decided to transfer, and I transferred to Salem, Oregon. Now, Salem was not my first choice. There were 4 towns that I tried to transfer to, but Salem was the first to respond. When I looked at it, I said, well, the word Salem comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace or rest. And that's what I was looking for. This is a sign from God. So we moved to Salem. We rented the biggest truck that we could get, and we got there with no problem. And we've been living there for 35 years now. And my wife, Kathy, and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary this past July with our 7 children and 6 grandchildren. Now, interesting post note is that after I got back to Michigan, I had to replace my transmission for the second time because it did get fried on that trip. And GERSZTYN, the company that I rented the trailer from went out of business because they went bankrupt for the second time. And just today I was thinking, you know what a good song would be to use as a theme song for it? Running Down a Dream by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers.
Thanks, Bob. Tonight's story by Bob was brought to you by every moving company ever. Now we're going to hear from a person on the front line of this work, Pamela Taylor, Chief Communications and Marketing Officer for No Kid Hungry, so we can learn a little bit more about how all of us can help. Here she's in conversation with Storytellers Project founder Megan Finnerty.
With that, I want to bring up today's Q&A. We're here with Pamela Taylor. She's our Chief Communications Officer and Marketing Officer for No Kid Hungry. And she wants to help us understand a little bit more about how all of us can help. Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Aren't these stories like, it's a lot, right? We so appreciate all of the work that you and your organization does. So let's get into it. You know, in the decade before the pandemic, No Kid Hungry and its partner organizations had really made huge strides in cutting childhood hunger. But now some of those gains have been lost. Can you talk to us about that 1 in 6 number, kind of what the situation looks like this school year?
Yeah, so, in 2018, we saw some of the lowest rates of childhood hunger that we had seen in a decade. The numbers were about 1 in 7 children, almost 1 in 8 children were facing hunger. During the pandemic, right around March of last year, when everything started to shut down, school doors were closing, and schools were trying to do just what Peggy described, we saw that number go as close to 1 in 4. And we've seen some improvements because of a lot of things that have happened. So the number is this year around 1 in 6 children may be living with hunger. It's not where we want it to be, but we're definitely starting to trend back in the right direction.
That's great. That's really what we're here is, right? Like we said before, that there is a solution to these things. I wanted to talk about, you guys really worked hard last year to adjust some of the policies at the federal and state and local levels. Can you talk a little bit more about that flexibility in distributing food and some of the things that you found worked and what you're trying to make durable?
Exactly. So just like everyone else, we had to figure things out quickly. And one of the things that we learned right away is there are parameters and restrictions in place on where kids can consume food. When food is given out for school breakfast or lunch or after school meals, that needs to be done on school property. Well, what happens when schools are closed? What are children supposed to do? So we had to, as an organization, work with our advocacy groups, our own government relations teams, and make sure the federal government was willing to make some adjustments so that schools and parents and teachers could get food to kids that weren't at school. So we saw opportunities where parents could come by and pick up meals for their kids without having to have their kids in their car. Initially, when this first started, the kids had to be present. That wasn't the safest and healthiest thing to do. So the federal government recognized that that was probably not the best option, lifted some waivers by the USDA so that parents could come and pick up meals for their kids and take them back home. A lot of what Peggy just described, where they used their school buses and they went into neighborhoods and were able to drop off meals for children. Everybody had to get super creative and figure out what policies do we need to look at differently so that we can meet the need of the people where they are during the time that we're in. A lot of those policy changes, though, have been implemented even beyond where we were this time last year. We've seen things like SNAP benefit increases for families, so that there is additional money for meals and to get groceries and other things that their families need to have nutritious meals every day. We're seeing things that we just didn't know. How long were people going to be out of work? How long were we going to be able to provide the meals that everyone needed? So these additional SNAP benefits turned out to be really, really beneficial to families.
Thank you for going into that kind of detail, because I think it's hard for people in the abstract, like government policies and bureaucracies, right? It's kind of hard to picture. So just the specificity around No Kid Hungry and some of its partners saying back to the federal government, hey, if you have 3 kids in a house and they all have different class schedules and they're all different ages, it might be physically impossible for the mom to find, or the dad to find, an hour when they're not all in class, or they all have a break and they can all pile into the car, get the food, prove they exist.
That's
like,
right.
It's a nightmare. Yeah.
That's
and so
right.
I really hear that, things. Anyway, it's complicated. But another thing that came up for a lot of us last year, in addition to being, I think, like really aware of bureaucracies, is how not everybody, depending on where you volunteered or where you lived, might have imagined how widespread hunger is. And after seeing so many nights on the light of news coverage of lines at food banks all across the country, do you feel like the pandemic exposed a hunger crisis? Did it create a hunger crisis? Was it already there? Help us understand, kind of from your position, what that looks like.
It did both, right? Hunger oftentimes is referred to as a hidden crisis. You can't see hunger on people all the time. And so what the pandemic did is it brought hunger to everybody's television, everybody's, mindset, because you couldn't help, like you said, but ignore the hours-long lines at food banks. What it also did is it made hunger much more visible. In other words, people started to see their neighbors in line and their kids' classmates in line and their, friends and families from church in line. People who didn't experience hunger before were certainly facing it in a way that they had never done before. And I think it was important that we tried to make sure people did not feel any kind of shame or stigma around having this moment that no one planned for. No one planned to lose their jobs. No one planned for schools to be closed. No one planned for everything to shut down. And we've heard many times people say, many of us are, one paycheck away from a disaster. And this is what was revealed. This was what the crisis revealed. In addition to all the things that the crisis was, it revealed another crisis. And so I think people had a different understanding and appreciation for the crisis of hunger. And this was something that it made everyone kind of step back and say, wow, I didn't know that it was so pervasive. I didn't know that it was so close to me. I didn't know it could come into my own kitchen. And that was something that I think everyone kind of really got a very up close and personal view with last year.
I mean, that feels very true. I know I'd have Zoom calls with my family, and it was a conversation I had with my siblings. We all live in different cities all throughout the West, and each of us talked about, where were we funneling our donations and how many people it seemed like needed our help, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. We have time for one more question, and I want to go back to that 1 in 6 number. We know it's down from at the peak of the pandemic, so we have a lot to be confident that your donations can make a difference. But talk to us for a second about, a lot of people are aware that they need to donate. How does our donation today, like, where does that money go? How much money have you already donated? Like, kind of give us a sense of scope.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is the generosity and just sheer humanity of America showed up last year when people saw, neighbors and television screens full of food bank lines. Donations poured into No Kid Hungry, and we are so eternally grateful for everyone that showed up for us. Our corporate partners showed up for us. Partners that we had never worked with before wanted to know, what can we do to help? And things that people didn't even think about because, like I said, no one had faced this before. How do we do this? What do we need? How do we transport a cafeteria full of food to neighborhoods all over our school district? So the money went towards refrigerators and portable coolers and portable heaters, and some areas where people couldn't get to school to get the food, they needed transportation. And so school districts bought vans and shuttles so that they could load them up with bags of food so that They could go into neighborhoods just like Peggy described. There were so many things. We needed PPE, of course. We needed to make sure everyone that was going out to distribute food or hand out food, they were safe and healthy. We had inclement weather, all over the country. Depending on where you live, it could have been really hot or super cold. And we wanted to provide funding so that they could protect themselves from the elements. This was going on every single day for about 16 to 18 months. And here we are. What we are so grateful for is since March of 2020, the numbers just came out yesterday. No Kid Hungry has been able to donate $98 million in grants to schools and school districts and community-based organizations all across the country, to about 2,300 different schools and school districts. That is because people have been so very generous to us. And just like you said, if you could today or sometime in the near future, go to nokidhungry.org/USA Today, we would be so, so grateful. We've not seen a decline in our donations. People understand the crisis, they understand the need, and they also understand how important it is to make sure we have no kid going hungry.
Oh man, Pam, thank you so, so, so much for your time today, bringing us these messages, walking us through these talking points. And thank you for doing your job every day. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Pamela and Megan, for those insights in that conversation. I want to move on now to our fourth storyteller of the night, Jim Fleming from Reno, Nevada. So far, we've laughed, we've cried. Now we're going to juggle some kittens.
Spoiler alert. Hey, thanks a lot, Brett. Yeah, that's this story is about my dad juggling 3 kittens. Not gonna mention that until the third paragraph, but here we go. One day, I walked home from high school, and my younger siblings, I had 2 younger brothers, 2 younger sisters. They're really animated about something. They said, "Oh, hey, Dad, Jim's here. Do it again." My dad had just done something, apparently. So aside from my brothers and sisters' paroxysms of joy bouncing off every glass surface in the house, it's also my mom giving me another context clue. My dad had just performed some recent heroics. I saw her exasperated affect, her rolling eyes, slowly crossed arms, and that's a common decorative motif for a lot of my favorite childhood memories. Dad's excitement about something creative, funny, a little bit destructive, and my mom having some very adult-themed disapproval of it. Other things my mom was recently against was when my dad realized that when washing the car that the end of our minivan would make a great first 40% of a water slide, or when he let us play Nintendo in the tub. So that's a good record. At the time, I thought their gender typically contrasting approaches to child safety was kind of a obligatory ceremonial preamble to any type of mischief. For my mom, a de rigueur little registration complaint that her heart was no longer in. That act often worked brilliantly as kind of a vaudevillian buddy act, like a little tension to set up before some comedy was about to ensue, usually involving impertinent misusage of pets or appliances. At least at the time, I thought of it that way. My dad grabbed 2 kittens in his left hand and one in his right. I had big guitar-playing carpentry hands. My dad was a music teacher. Spoiler alert. Oh, wait, no, not spoiler alert. Background, our cat just had kittens. By the way, this led to the stupidest conversation I've ever heard, which was, "I'm pretty sure we got that cat fixed," my mom said as the cat was licking the head of one of her nursing babies. My dad says, yeah, we definitely took it in to get spayed, he said as the cat carried her young ones by the scruff of their neck back into the closet. We definitely got that cat fixed. But like they said in Jurassic Park, nature finds a way. I guess God just wanted our 1,500-foot domicile to have a 20th living mammal in it. Anyway, he starts juggling these cats. I've told that story quite a few times. Storytelling shows, stand-up comedy. And I always just thought it was some stupid, a fun story to break out at in a social situation. But now lately, I go back to the look on my mom's face, and I think about how exhausted you probably get in that role, always being the human guardrail, the parachute, the safety net, always having to issue a few words of opprobrium in the face of some behavior which she knew was going to complicate her life over the next hour or so in ways yet to be determined. I mean, maybe all moms face an uphill battle in their housemates' inability to predict consequences. Even the cartoons we watch seem to be against my mom. If you weren't the token responsible adult in the family, if you're the other one, imagine the emotional toll of the other adult and the kids constantly siding you against fun, and the heartache of knowing that the apples of your eye will always see you as the scheming but ultimately failed and impotent, unsuccessful villain in the Hanna-Barbera cartoon, the animated heavy whose motivations are less characterized by evil than they are by unreasonableness. You're just kind of against the concept of joie de vivre in general. Found out from a friend that there's a term for this: mental load or invisible labor, emotional labor, that distaff that just kind of becomes the mom's job because she, by being the person who gives a shit, by the person who is not willing to let that stuff go, she's kind of hoisted by her own petard, and it becomes her job. What's that? That sounds dirty, but actually it's just French, which again makes it dirty sounding. Anyway, that work, that load may be invisible, but it is not weightless, and I think it bears a cost. So my dad has two kittens in his left hand, one in his right. He just starts juggling these things, and he's great at juggling. Just keeping him eye level, just perfect rhythm. And I don't know if you've seen kittens juggled before. You probably saw a version of it in the movie The Jerk by Steve Martin. But it always looks like it's in slow motion. All the cats are like out of a scene from The Matrix. Just it's balletic and it's beautiful. I mean, if you have to look at it kind of amorally, kind of value neutral, because it's, you don't want to hurt kittens. But the kittens were very surprised to be juggled. They were just they're freaking out, despite the fact that apparently they'd just been juggled 5 minutes before. Thing about my mom is just not just the having to be the wet blanket all the time. There was probably in our situation like a little bit more going on with that look. She knew that my dad was in a really excited kind of up phase, like there probably would be an equal and opposite down phase later on. Like, works really hard, maybe spend the next couple days just kind of quiet, moping around. Or maybe the next up phase wouldn't be as productive as juggling kittens. Maybe it would be directed into the face of a cop that he was yelling at the time, or maybe a card table. I don't want to complain too much about my dad. He's a perfect father, pillar of the community. There's probably going to be a music building named after him. What they say about Carnegie Hall, practice gets all the publicity. But in my dad's case, getting to Carnegie Hall took like going through the yellow pages of our phone book and calling every number, writing every address to get donations to take the kids out there. But still, sometimes that was tough for my mom. Money would get spent, and a lot of cornflakes and ketchup would have to go into taking a pound of meat and turning that into 3 pounds of meatloaf. So these kittens are flying through the air. They're stretching out like accordions. Their little paws pawing at the air. Each of them desperately trying not to be the first in their species, not to land on their feet. This must have been a weird day for these kittens. They'd just been born, so apparently being juggled is just part of the feline condition. Like, I guess this is what it's like to be alive on planet Earth. But all right, still. I feel bad for those kittens, but more so now than at the time. As a kid, I just felt pride. If my dad had been juggling the heads of the world's 3 most brutal dictators, I could not have been more proud. Many people have the ability to juggle kittens. Many people have the desire to juggle kittens, but the Venn diagram, combining those two groups, the intersection contains only one man that I know of anyway, and that's my dad. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks for telling that story, Jim. It's kind of weird. Like, all of us had this, somewhere in our lives growing up, a good cop and a bad cop. And the older I get, the more I identify with the bad cop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just, wow. Things change. So our final storyteller tonight, Sally Jo Bano of Phoenix, Arizona, who's going to talk about the specific smell that reminds her of her childhood home, and it's not the smell you think. Sally Jo?
Ooh, that smell. Can't you smell that smell? Someone recently asked me what scented candle I wish they made. And I can't remember what I actually told them, but the first thought that popped into my head was skunk. Now, I probably don't really want my house to smell like skunk, but I love the smell of skunk. And I think it reminds me of home. I didn't grow up on a skunk farm. I didn't have a pet skunk. But I do have 2 theories as to why this skunk smell loving got developed. The first one is, I grew up in Michigan, and any chance that my father got off work, we were jumping in the car, packing suitcases and the dog and fishing poles, and making a 4-hour drive to my grandparents' little tiny cottage on a little remote lake in Ontario, Canada. Now, it was a 4-hour drive, and the second we got across the border into Canada, there was no trash. The air was cleaner. The grass was greener. Inevitably, in 4 hours, down country roads, you're going to pass at least a couple of skunks, maybe more. And I remember every time we pass a skunk, my mom would be in the front seat with my dad, and she would hurriedly start rolling up her window and say, roll up your windows, roll up your windows. Oh, skunk, skunk, skunk. It never bothered me that much. I rolled my window up anyway, just because it bothered her so much, but it never really bothered me. And I think that it reminded me of this amazing place where we were going. And we'd stop on the way there, and there was one particular roadside produce stand where we'd stop. And they had the best, biggest, juiciest, reddest beefsteak tomatoes. I can still taste that tomato. In fact, I'm tasting it right now while I'm describing it to you, and it is exquisite. I have yet to find a tomato that tastes like those tomatoes tasted. So we'd load up on those tomatoes and corn, and we'd head on our way to the lake. And on the way, just before we got to the cottage, we'd stop at Mrs. Monk's bait shop. And my dad would pull out his minnow bucket, and we'd buy minnows from Mrs. Monk's. And that minnow smell that was now in the car, because we didn't want it to tip over, reminded me that we were probably going to have a big perch dinner by the end of the time at the cottage. And my grandmother made this delicious, buttery, Parmesan light perch breading that was magnificent. And so we'd get to the lake. My dad and I had this ritual, and it either happened right when we got to the lake or right before we left. And the ritual was we'd throw on our bathing suits, and we'd go stand in the middle of this long yard, and we'd run down to the lake, dive in. You had to go underwater, and then you'd pop up and whip your hair back and go, woo! And then we'd just start laughing. It was just this bonding thing that my dad and I had. The cottage was not anything grand. It was one of those prefab house kits that you can buy that all the men in the family put up one weekend. And so it was tiny, and all the cousins would sleep shoulder to shoulder to shoulder across the living room floor, all the way up to the dining room, where the adults would play cards and laugh and drink Molson's Canadian beer well into the night. And my grandmother had this boisterous laugh that was like a siren. And those sounds were my lullaby at night. It was fantastic. We'd go out at night and there would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fireflies as far as you could see. We could see on some nights the northern lights, which were dancing colored lights that were magical, especially to me as a little girl. And I remember my big brother, who I idolized. I remember sitting out on the dock at the end of the dock with him, and it had just turned dark. And he taught me how to sit really still so that the bats would skim across the top of your hair. I know that sounds pretty creepy, but it was pretty exciting, and I felt safe with him. I didn't think I was going to be hurt. And then he also showed me one night how to spot shooting stars. I didn't know what shooting stars were, and he mentioned it. And so we laid on our backs on the dock, and he showed me how to like scan a certain portion of the sky and just focus your eyes there until you saw shooting stars go across. So I have amazing memories of that time of my life. And I think that even on the way back, as my parents were singing almost all the way home in the front seat, and we would pass inevitably more skunks coming home, I think it reminds me of that idyllic time in my life. Now, my second theory is, I mentioned I'm from Michigan. The little town I'm from was known as Bath City of America in the late 1800s, early 1900s, up until the mid 70s. And the story goes that someone was drilling for oil in my town, and they did not strike oil. They struck this thick, briny liquid. They tried to extract the salt out of it to see if that could be lucrative. Didn't happen. And so they had all these barrels of this briny water. And so one day, this farmer had an old, decrepit horse that had been put out to pasture, and this horse was standing under one of the barrels, and the barrels was dripping, and he was licking the brine and drinking it. And he got down and rolled in this brine mud that was created from the dripping. And the next day, this old, decrepit horse was bounding around like a colt in the pasture. So another man in town saw this, and he had severe eczema, and he thought, I'm going to try and see if that briny water helps my eczema. So he rolled in the brine water himself, and his eczema was cured. So someone had the brilliant idea to open mineral spas in Bath City of America. And it became this big deal. People came from all over the world: Mae West, Clark Gable, Jack Dempsey, William Randolph Hearst. People would bring their families for the whole summer and take the healing baths all summer. And I remember in the summer, the days that the baths were running, you would open your door to go outside, and there would be this thick smell of sulfur, rotten eggs, skunk. And that meant the baths were running that day, and it permeated everything. And I remember people just not being able to stand the smell, and it never bothered me that much. It just, to me, was just what my home smelled like. And I remember one time my mom, I was in preschool, and she took me by the hand into one of the grand hotels that were put up. There was the Medea and the Original and the Park and the Eureka and the Colonial. And so we had a tailor in one of these buildings, and my mom took me by the hand into this building. And I remember walking inside and seeing marble, and it was so grand, like a palace in my town. I had no idea anything like that existed there. So in the 70s, as I said, those spas all shut down, and I think there's only one of those hotels left. And in fact, my high school team, the mascot is Butch Bather, who's this old-timey guy in one of those striped 1920s bathing suits. We were the Battling Bathers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Battling Bathers. Don't take no jive. Come on, let's jive. Come on, let's jive. We had all kinds of cheers for the Battling Bathers. So I came home for a visit some years after the baths had closed, and someone mentioned to me that someone had opened one of the mineral spas and they were offering baths. I got so excited. I was never old enough to go take one of the baths. I was a kid when they closed. And so my sister and I went, and you go into a big stone bathtub, and they fill up the tub and you float. The water is you're so buoyant in the water because of all the minerals, you can't stay down in the water. So they put weights on your legs and you sit in the water. But what disappointed me about that experience is they neutralized the smell. So it just didn't smell like home for me, because apparently I need just a hint of skunk in my mineral bath to make it smell like home.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm now thinking back on memories of smelling skunks in childhood, and I definitely remember the smell of a wharf, which not everybody loves, but I get that. And if we're talking about skunks, that means it's time to wrap up this edition of the Virtual Storytellers Project for the West Coast. One last pitch. Remember, again, tonight's show has been partially benefits the No Kid Hungry. You can donate right now by going to nokidhungry.org/USA Today. Thanks again. Huge thanks to all the work put in by our storytellers, Sharee Hertz, Kara Lopez-Lee, Bob GERSZTYN, Jim Fleming, and Sally Jo Bano. Thank you guys all for your hard work, and thanks to the audience for joining us tonight. Good night, everybody.
Bye.